If you watched college hoops in the late 80s, you knew when a player had that undeniable natural gift. Richard Dumas was one of those guys. Standing 6'7", he played with a fluid, high-flying style that made the game look completely effortless. He wasn't just running the floor, he was gliding over it. When you watched him attack the rim, you saw a pure top-tier talent who had all the physical tools to become an absolute force at the professional level. Between 1987 and 1990, playing 3 seasons at Oklahoma State, he was electric. According to college basketball records, he consistently demonstrated the kind of elite athleticism that should have made him a guaranteed lottery pick. He was putting up numbers and generating the right kind of tape. But off the court, a different kind of tape was rolling. A sudden, mysterious dismissal from his college team created a massive red flag for professional scouts. Reporters noted at the time that the reasons for his departure were kept relatively quiet, but the silence only fueled the speculation behind closed doors. Why did a player with obvious, transcendent physical gifts suddenly find himself sliding down every draft board in the country? Disturbing rumors began to follow him, hinting at a destructive dependency that front offices were terrified to gamble on. In the early 90s, teams were desperate for stars, but they were also highly protective of their investments. When the June 1991 NBA draft finally arrived, the hesitation was visible. According to official NBA draft archives, Dumas watched name after name come off the board until he fell all the way into the second round, ultimately selected 46th overall by the Phoenix Suns. It was a steep, humbling drop for a man with first-round abilities. The Suns felt they had stolen a premier athlete for pennies on the dollar, hoping a strong locker room could keep him focused on the hardwood. But before he could even log a single minute in a Phoenix Suns practice jersey, a phone call from the league office hit the franchise with a devastating zero-tolerance mandate. To understand what happened next, you have to remember the climate of professional basketball in the early 90s. The league was cracking down hard, trying to clean up its public image, and the front office in New York was not handing out second chances lightly. Just as Richard was packing his bag to start his rookie campaign, the gavel came down. He was suspended for the entire 1991 to 1992 NBA season for violating the league's strict substance policy, according to major sports media reports from that era. Just like that, the multi-million-dollar dream was put on ice. Instead of stepping onto the polished floors of Western Conference arenas, Richard had to find work wherever he could. The game of basketball is unforgiving. If you aren't playing, people forget you exist. According to international basketball registries, he was forced to relocate over 6,000 miles away to play for Hapoel Holon in Israel during that long gap year. Television coverage at the time focused on the glitz and glamour of the incoming Dream Team era, celebrating the game's greatest ambassadors on a global stage. Meanwhile, Richard was thousands of miles away from the spotlight, trying to keep his career alive in a foreign league. Who was keeping an eye on him in those obscure gyms, and what could possibly convince the Phoenix front office that this troubled second-round pick was still worth the headache? The reality of that year overseas was a heavy grind. It was a humbling detour that stripped away the flash of being a drafted professional. There were no bright lights, no massive sneaker deals waiting in the wings, just the daily, grueling effort of trying to prove he could stay clean and stay in shape. The Suns brass quietly monitored his progress, looking for any sign that the young forward had finally turned a corner. Cast out to the global basketball wilderness, it seemed his NBA window had permanently closed, until a surprising roster move in late 1992 handed him a one-way ticket back to Arizona. When Richard Dumas finally put on the purple and orange jersey, the relief in Phoenix was palpable, but the expectations were cautious. He was joining a stacked team led by the loud, demanding, and fiercely competitive Charles Barkley. It was a fast-paced roster built for a deep playoff run, not a rehabilitation center for unproven rookies. But from the moment Richard stepped onto the court, the narrative flipped completely. He made his long-awaited debut in December 1992, immediately sparking the Phoenix offense, according to team box scores. He didn't look rusty, and he certainly didn't look like a guy who had spent the last year wandering the basketball wilderness. He played with a fearless, aggressive attitude, driving hard to the basket and locking down veteran defenders. He was catching lobs, filling the lanes on the fast break, and playing with a quiet, undeniable swagger that caught the rest of the league completely off guard. According to official basketball archives, he averaged a stunning 15.8 points and 4.6 rebounds in just his first 19 regular season games. He was highly efficient, shooting an incredible percentage from the floor and seamlessly blending into the team's high-octane system. In interviews, his veteran teammates expressed genuine amazement at how quickly he adapted to the professional pace. They praised his work ethic and his natural instincts on the wing, but the undercurrent of his past was always there. How does a guy who spent a year in basketball exile suddenly look like the best athlete on a championship contending floor? The media praised his comeback, yet reporters were constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, wondering if this explosive form was a permanent change or just a temporary high. He wasn't just a feel-good comeback story anymore. He had become the missing piece of a championship puzzle, setting up a brutal, highly publicized collision course in June 1993 with the most dominant basketball dynasty of the decade. If you remember the 1993 NBA Finals, you remember the absolute spectacle of it all. It was a heavyweight clash between two incredibly powerful rosters. The Phoenix Suns had finished that 1992 to 1993 regular season with a massive 62-win record, relying heavily on Richard's unexpected mid-season spark, according to league history books. They were deep, they were talented, and they had home court advantage. But waiting for them in the finals was the ultimate test. A Chicago Bulls machine chasing its first three-peat. For a player who had just been playing in minor overseas gyms a year prior, stepping onto this specific stage should have been paralyzing. Television coverage at the time focused intensely on the marquee matchup between Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan. But right in the middle of that historic, blinding spotlight, a rookie was quietly stealing possessions. When the lights were the brightest, why didn't the immense pressure of defending the greatest player on earth break him? Instead of shrinking, Richard matched the energy of the moment. He played with a loose, confident stride, constantly attacking the rim and refusing to back down from the physical, punishing defense of the Chicago veterans. The peak of this brief, brilliant era happened in June 1993, specifically during Game 5. Facing elimination in front of a hostile Chicago crowd, Richard dropped 25 points, slashing through the paint and keeping the Suns alive, a performance permanently logged in television broadcast transcripts. He was hitting contested shots and running the floor with an elite burst of speed. For those 2.5 hours, fans across the country believed they were watching the birth of a perennial all-star. He had survived the ultimate test against Jordan, but the brightest stadium lights were completely hiding a private battle that would abruptly erase him from the active roster before the fall training camp even began. Just as his jersey sales were climbing and his reputation as a fearless wing was cementing, the floor completely fell out. The offseason following that historic finals run should have been a time for celebrating a newly signed extension and preparing for another championship push. Instead, the story took a painful turn. The personal crises he had masked so well during the playoffs suddenly caught up with him. In September 1993, the league office dropped the hammer, suspending him indefinitely for violating the league's strict policy on banned substances, a devastating development detailed in a press conference transcript. The swiftness of the punishment was a harsh reminder of the era's zero-tolerance stance. One day he was a core piece of a title contender, and the next he was completely exiled from team facilities. Reporters noted at the time that the suddenness of the announcement left the Phoenix locker room stunned and searching for answers. Who knew what was truly happening behind closed doors, and why couldn't a veteran-heavy team with strong leadership pull him back from the edge? While the public saw the high-flying athlete behind the scenes, he reportedly struggled with a destructive dependency that overpowered his professional ambitions. The business of professional basketball moved on without him. The Suns had to retool their rotation, drafting and trading to fill the massive hole left by their starting forward. According to player movement logs, he registered exactly 0 games played during the entire 1993 to 1994 season. It was a complete phantom year. The question shifting around the league wasn't just about his recovery anymore. It was whether the NBA's ruthless 3-strike mandate would trigger a permanent lifetime ban before his 25th birthday. When a player hits that level of professional rock bottom, the road back is rarely glamorous. It requires stripping away the ego and the lifestyle of the league. Enter John Lucas, a former player who had fought and survived his own highly publicized battles with dependency. Lucas had transitioned into coaching and addiction counseling. He understood the specific isolating darkness that troubled athletes faced better than almost anyone in the sport. Throughout 1994, Richard spent extensive time completely out of the public eye, reportedly entering Lucas's specialized Houston-based recovery program, a quiet period documented in sports media feature articles. This was not about basketball drills or getting up shots in an empty gym. It was about intense accountability, group therapy, and confronting the root causes of his personal crisis. In public material, journalists and broadcasters frequently cited Lucas as the final safety net for players who had burned every other bridge. What exactly changed in his daily routine during those quiet months away from the cameras? And was it enough to rebuild a shattered foundation? The process was grueling. To even be considered for reinstatement, the NBA required passing heavily monitored mandatory substance screenings, according to the collective bargaining agreement rules of that era. He had to prove to the front office, the commissioner and himself, that he could sustain a clean lifestyle outside the controlled environment of a rehab center. Eventually, the hard work seemed to pay off. The league cleared him, and the Phoenix Suns decided to give their former breakout star one more chance to salvage his career. He had passed the rigorous test and officially reclaimed his roster spot, but the player who eventually walked back onto the hardwood in Arizona would produce a brutal statistical collapse that forced the front office to make a final, permanent decision. The city of Phoenix held its collective breath, waiting for the return of their breakout star. After spending months away from the arena, working through intense personal rehabilitation, the moment of truth finally arrived. According to game date registries, Richard officially returned to the hardwood in March 1995, stepping back into the lineup for the crucial late-season push. The crowd was eager, and the front office was desperately hoping to see flashes of the same fearless wing who had electrified the finals 2 years earlier. But the player who jogged onto the court in 1995 looked fundamentally different. Television coverage at the time focused heavily on his altered mechanics and a noticeable lack of lift, questioning if the heavy physical and mental toll of his time away had permanently robbed him of his elite athleticism. The explosive first step that used to blow past defenders was simply gone. Instead of confidently attacking the rim, he looked hesitant, struggling to find his rhythm in a rotation that had already learned how to play without him. The calm, harsh reality of professional basketball is that patience runs out quickly when the numbers drop. In official team statistics, his production plummeted, averaging a mere 5.5 points over just 15 appearances. He was no longer the highly efficient scoring threat who could take over a quarter. The coaching staff grew increasingly frustrated trying to integrate him, and the narrative inside the organization began to shift. Was the decline purely physical, born from months away from top-tier conditioning, or had the weight of the suspension simply broken his competitive spirit? The organization realized they could no longer afford to wait for a spark that might never return. The Phoenix front office finally admitted defeat, shipping him off in a late-season trade that felt less like a fresh start and more like a final desperate warning. The trade sent Richard to the East Coast, landing him with the Philadelphia 76ers. On paper, it was the perfect change of scenery, primarily because it reunited him with head coach John Lucas. Lucas was the man who had championed his recovery in Houston, the mentor who understood his struggles better than any executive in the league. If anyone could unlock the dormant talent inside the troubled forward and keep him grounded in a new city, it was supposed to be Lucas. According to major sports media reports from that era, there was immense pressure on Lucas, not just to win basketball games, but to successfully rehabilitate the troubled talent he brought into his locker room. During the 1995 to 1996 season, Richard managed to get on the court for 39 games with the Sixers, according to archived roster stats. There were brief, fleeting moments where he would hit a smooth pull-up jumper or finish a tough transition layup, reminding the older heads in the crowd of the man who once went toe-to-toe with Chicago. But those flashes of old brilliance were heavily overshadowed by grinding inconsistency. According to Basketball Archives, he averaged only 6.2 points, playing roughly 18 minutes a night before slowly falling out of the regular rotation entirely. The ultimate mentor-player pairing was failing to yield results on the floor, and the whispers behind the scenes suggested that the off-court battles were creeping back into his daily life. Why couldn't a familiar voice keep the demons at bay in a brand new environment? Despite having his closest advocate calling the plays from the sidelines, the strict league substance protocols were triggered once more, resulting in a mandatory suspension that slammed the NBA door shut for the very last time. When the NBA permanently banishes a player, the cameras stop rolling, the major endorsements vanish, but the need to survive remains. At 27 years old, an age when most elite forwards are entering their athletic prime, Richard Dumas found himself completely locked out of the only profitable industry he knew. He was forced into the long, grueling afterlife of a banished talent, transitioning from a celebrated franchise centerpiece to a basketball nomad. Between 1997 and 2003, he suited up for more than 10 different obscure minor league and overseas teams. A staggering, exhausting journey logged in international basketball registries. According to European League databases, his travels included a brief, unceremonious stint in Puerto Rico in 1997, followed by stops in France, Poland, and Bosnia, before he formally retired in 2003. The luxury charters in five-star hotels were replaced by cramped buses and delayed commercial flights. As sports reporters noted years later in retrospective pieces, the mental toll of this dramatic fall was unimaginably heavy. Going from guarding Michael Jordan in the finals to playing in half-empty, freezing overseas gyms requires a brutal swallowing of pride. What drives a man to keep lacing up his sneakers in total obscurity when the millions are gone, and the ultimate dream is permanently dead? It was a humbling reality where the sport transitioned from a glorious, high-flying calling to a desperate month-to-month paycheck. But when the overseas contracts finally dried up and the minor league checks stopped arriving for good, the real world was waiting, and it was going to be incredibly unforgiving. Stepping away from the game for good brings a heavy silence that most athletes are completely unprepared for. When the final overseas contract expires, the transition back to an ordinary life can be an incredibly jarring experience, especially without a solid financial safety net. In retrospective media interviews, it was revealed that Richard spent nearly a decade, from 2004 to 2012, entirely detached from the NBA media landscape. He was completely off the grid. Reporters noted years later that he quietly faded into the background of the very city that used to chant his name. How does a recognized local sports hero become practically invisible in his own community? What happens when the cheering stops and the real-world bills start stacking up fast? The reality was harsh. As reported by sports finance commentators, he lost an estimated several $million in voided NBA contracts during the mid to late 90s, severely compounded by heavy league fines and the cost of maintaining a fast-paced lifestyle. Without the massive, guaranteed checks of a veteran contract, the money drained quickly. He was forced to take on regular, everyday jobs, with some sources claiming he even worked overnight cleaning shifts just to make ends meet. It is a sobering, quiet chapter of his life. He was a man who had once flown in private team jets, now navigating the daily grind of the working class while managing the lingering physical aches of a professional basketball career. He kept his head down, staying far away from the television cameras and the sports radio debates. For almost 10 years, nobody in the national sports media spoke the name Richard Dumas, until a stunning local news broadcast in late 2013 flashed a mugshot that completely broke the hearts of his older fans. Seeing a former high-flying star on the evening news for all the wrong reasons is a specific kind of gut punch for anyone who loves the game. According to public police records, the quiet decade ended abruptly when he was arrested in December 2013 by federal authorities. The charges were completely unexpected. Television coverage at the time focused intensely on the bizarre and shocking details of the case. Why would a man who once commanded elite professional salaries and played on international stages find himself at the center of such strange, petty allegations? Unsealed court documents showed he faced 8 felony counts of organized retail theft, specifically linked to incidents at the Luke Air Force Base Exchange store in Arizona. Authorities alleged he was involved in lifting everyday items like cigarettes, shoes, and basic electronics. The visual contrast presented to the public was incredibly painful. News stations displayed side-by-side images of the 1993 Finals breakout player next to a somber, aging man facing severe legal trouble over stolen retail goods. According to press coverage, the story served as a harsh reminder of how far a player can fall when the strict structure, support staff, and steady income of a professional sports franchise are permanently removed. It wasn't an explosive Hollywood scandal. It was just a sad, quiet tragedy playing out in local courtrooms. Facing the very real threat of serious prison time, its defense team urgently scrambled for a resolution, bringing the former high flyer in front of a judge to finally answer for his long, complicated fall from grace. When the cameras follow you into a courtroom, the game is no longer about protecting a basketball legacy. It is strictly about survival and accountability. The legal crisis stretched on for nearly a year as his attorneys worked the system. In December 2014, court transcripts showed that he officially pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of theft in a desperate bid to avoid a lengthy incarceration. The courtroom is a cold, clinical place that strips away all the mythology of a professional athlete. Did the judge looking down from the bench see a hardened, lifelong criminal, or a broken former star who needed strict supervision and structure rather than a concrete cell? According to public sentencing records, the court opted for the latter, sentencing him to 3 years of probation under strict judicial supervision. During the proceedings, he expressed genuine remorse, quietly taking responsibility for his actions before the court. The agreement required him to stay out of trouble, check in regularly, and adhere to all the guidelines set by the state. This wasn't a triumphant comeback story or a miraculous overnight turnaround. It was simply a middle-aged man doing exactly what he needed to do to stay free and rebuild a quiet, manageable life. The heavy gavel finally came down to keep him out of a state prison cell, but the harshest judgment he would face outside those courtroom doors was the heavy, unresolved weight of his own complicated legacy. When you look back at the long, complicated history of professional basketball, there are Hall of Famers, there are reliable journeymen, and then there is that rare, haunting category of the what if. Richard Dumas belongs firmly and forever in that last group. His story forces older fans and basketball historians to hold two very different realities in their hands at the same time. An incredibly brief, brilliant peak on the championship stage, and a long, painful decline that quietly washed him out of the league. According to official career statistics, he finished his entire professional run having played a grand total of only 102 regular season NBA games. It is a staggering reality for a player who made such a massive cultural impact during an iconic era. In retrospective interviews, former teammates have often expressed sheer disbelief that a talent so profound could leave such a tiny statistical footprint on the record books. But how do we measure a career that burned so hot and vanished so fast? If the whistle had just blown a little differently, or if the modern support systems of today existed back then, would we be talking about a perennial all-star with a jersey hanging in the rafters? As the years have passed, the public perception has steadily softened. He was frequently cited in 2013 and 2023 media retrospectives as one of the greatest lost talents of the 1990s, according to sports media documentaries. Time has a way of filtering out the immediate anger and the front office frustration, leaving behind a profound sense of empathy. People no longer view his career strictly as a failure of discipline, but as a tragic collision between world-class athletic pressure and a severe personal crisis that he simply could not defeat alone. He left behind one of the most brilliant, frustrating, and incomplete highlight reels the sport has ever witnessed, cementing Richard Dumas as basketball's ultimate phantom star.